For the past several years, there have been two topics that have been a consistent part of the national debate. The first, which is the subject of a later episode, is abortion. The second, and the topic that we are going to talk about today, is firearms, or more specifically, the rights and privileges surrounding them. This topic could easily consume multiple episodes, but for now, I'm going to keep this somewhat generalized and will only cover the three main talking points of the political left, while also providing a simplified history lesson to help demonstrate context. Should be fun. There are both general and specific elements that make up the cultures of the Western world. Those general elements are what bind us together, and that's largely from values anchored in a common morality that has evolved over time due to a shared history. Within the Western world, no two countries exhibit this more than Canada and the United States, whose historic pasts are an interwoven mix of timelines, cultures, wars, and ancestries. As we all know, Canada is technically still a colony of the British Empire, with the Queen as our head of state. Like Canada, the United States started off as a colony of the British Empire, but for several reasons, the people of the 13 colonies wanted their independence. This led to the Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783, with the colonies eventually claiming victory. In the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, the colonies found themselves at the proverbial fork in the road of how to proceed with the construction of their new country. The path chosen was a significant departure from what they had been subject to under the British Empire. Eventually, the system of government of what was to become the United States centered around the rights and liberties of the people, while attempting to ensure that government would always be limited and, by extension, always be a servant to the people. This departure from the British system of government would become the main catalyst that would form one of the largest cultural distinctions between the two countries as both matured. In Canada, ownership of a firearm is a privilege granted at the discretion of government, which means that government can revoke it at will and without the consent of the people. In the United States, ownership of a firearm is a Second Amendment right under the Constitution, which is seen as immutable and almost impossible for the government to legally strip away from the people. So, you may be wondering how this cultural distinction came about and why it's important. The distinction came about as a result of two specific events that took place at very different times. The importance of this distinction is how it framed the approach that the political left modeled to achieve its goals. Let's start with the how. The first event goes back to the birth of the United States, whereby the Founding Fathers recognized certain truths relative to rights and freedoms, which is why there was a revolution in the first place. They wanted to ensure that freedom and liberty could never be taken away from the people again, and thus enshrine the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, into the nation's constitution. This simple act turned what was once a privilege into a right. This also offered the people recourse in perpetuity against government should they seek to take any action to circumvent the rights granted to the people. The second event only goes back some 60 years within Canada due to the rise of social liberalism, which, as we reviewed in episode 2, began in the late 60s. Although this ideological shift happened in both countries, it was much more widely felt in Canada since Canada was, and still is, a British colony. This reality means that Canadians are still subject to the Crown and the Canadian legal system, which is rooted in English common law, where there are no rights relative to firearms or property. Since the political left only had to contend with a privilege and not an enshrined right, this made the process of chipping away at firearm ownership relatively easy over the ensuing decades, which eventually reshaped today's national thinking, whereby most Canadians recoil at the mere thought of firearm ownership. Now, let's move on to the importance of this cultural distinction. The goal of the political left since the beginning of social liberalism has always been a total ban on firearms. Despite protestations to the contrary, the actions exhibited by the political left makes the end goal clear and unmistakable. The only real change over the past decade or so is that they have stopped trying to deceive the people and have been much more open about it to the point of arrogance. While the Democrats have a much steeper hill to climb in the achievement of this goal, they share a common tactical approach with the Liberals, which is to always frame the debate on a foundation of emotion, coupled with what can be referred to as progressive morality. This progressive morality always distills down to how you, the legal firearm owner, can support the ownership of something that is used to kill innocent people in general, and specifically defenseless children. This approach is always put into action in the aftermath of a tragic event where emotions, especially grief and anger, are running high. Although there are many different arguments that are employed, there are three main ones that are almost exclusively used with the emergence of a fourth. The first one is an umbrella statement, which is that there is no need for people to arm themselves in a civilized society, and that the ability to wield firearms should rest solely with law enforcement. This argument is usually constructed in whole or in part from the following points. Point number 1, we live in a civilized society under rule of law, whereby the threat to person is extremely low, therefore there is no need for firearms. Point number 2, if there is a threat to person, there are other measures a person can take to protect themselves that would not result in the loss of life. And point number 3, removing firearms from the public will ensure that the horrific violence using firearms would also come to an end as the primary weapon to commit violence has been removed. This point is further detailed as a means of reducing crime in general. The second argument is aimed at hunters, whereby the mature distribution channels of our food supply and the ease of availability negates the need to hunt for food. Therefore, there is no need for firearms. There is also a moral implication that works its way into this point, which is that we shouldn't be killing helpless animals for any reason, and those that do are cruel. The third argument is generally a catch-all statement when the other points don't achieve the desired result, which is to challenge you on why anyone needs or should want an assault rifle. Whether you own a rifle or not is immaterial, as its only intent is to set up a scenario whereby consensus can be achieved. Most firearm owners would agree that legitimate assault rifles should be kept out of the public sphere, and by doing so fall into this trap. The trap itself is misconception of a common definition. To the firearm owner, a true assault rifle is a firearm that conforms to various criteria, with the main one being a fully automatic firing system. However, to the political left, there is only 2 criteria, with the first one being the rifle is black and looks scary, and the second one being that their definition applies to whatever they want it to in the moment. This is an intentional deception, which then opens the door for the application of emotion and progressive morality. I'm going to deconstruct these points in reverse order, starting with the assault rifle statement and why a person would want one. When one hears the word assault rifle, it typically conjures up images of a Hollywood blockbuster whereby the hero mows down the villain with a single firearm and a rain of hellfire. The firearm is almost exclusively depicted as black in color, outfitted with a scope, large capacity magazine, and having a fully automatic firing mechanism. As a result, the general public has been trained to associate any similarly looking rifle as being an assault rifle. The most common civilian rifle that falls into this description is the AR-15, which is the one that proponents of gun control consistently cite in their arguments. So let's talk about the AR-15 for a moment. The most often stated piece of misinformation is that the AR stands for assault rifle. Indeed, that is what a relative of mine maintained during a discussion we once had. When I asked him why he thought that, he told me that that's what he heard on the news, in this case, our state broadcaster, the CBC. However, this misinformation is not limited to the CBC or Canada. I have seen similar claims by mainstream media across the Western world, with some of the most blatant misinformation coming from CNN's so-called firearms experts. So what does AR stand for? The AR stands for Armalite Rifle, which is the name of the company who first brought the rifle to market in 1958. This was a rifle that was specifically designed for the civilian market. The rifle was so well received because of its durability and multiple uses that a military version was created called the M16. Now, let's clear up a few other things about the AR-15 while we're here, as for some reason, the media across the Western world never seems to get around to telling the public the information it needs to know. So number 1, AR-15s are classified as restricted firearms, which makes them subject to additional requirements over and above non-restricted firearms, such as methods of transport and storage and where they can be used. Number 2, AR-15s that are legally available in Canada must conform to manufacturing guidelines, which makes them extremely difficult to support fully automatic firing. Further, it is illegal in Canada to possess a fully automatic AR-15, and is also illegal to import any parts that may allow you to achieve this. Number 3, AR-15s are restricted to low-capacity magazines and must be pinned to allow no more than 5 rounds in the magazine. Number 4, AR-15s are only legally allowed to be used in an approved firing range. You cannot legally discharge these firearms anywhere else for any reason. When I told my relative these facts, he was surprised due to the portrayal of the rifle by the media. Let's finish this one up with, why do you need an AR-15? The question itself is telling, as it immediately does 2 things. It puts the onus on the person to justify their purchase of a legally obtainable firearm and sets up the ensuing conversation centered on an emotional foundation whereby the political left can then further that discussion on morality while avoiding the real questions, which should be based on utility. If we remove the emotional approach, we are then left with the rational, which would be rooted in rights, privilege, and of course the law. This would mean that this question makes about as much sense as me asking someone why they need a sports car, or why someone needs 20 pairs of shoes. Simple answer from my point of view is because I can. The AR-15 is a legally available firearm that suits a variety of purposes. But wait, I can hear you yelling that shoes and cars aren't the same as firearms, and you'd be correct, they are not the same thing. But the underlying premise is identical. While I may not agree with the reasons for buying so many shoes or buying a ridiculously expensive sports car, I am left with an inescapable truth. I have no right to prevent others from using their money to purchase legally available products as they see fit, so long as they comply with all legal provisions surrounding the products in question. On to the second point. The ability to hunt to provide food is a survival instinct. While it is true that the overall food supply is readily available, it doesn't mean it's practical or cost-effective for everyone. I am originally from Northern Ontario, where the various hunting seasons are part of the culture. Not only is it a way for communal bonding amongst family and friends, it is also a way for men and women, and yes, I said women, to provide food for their family. All it takes is to harvest a few deer or one moose, and your freezer is full of meat for a year. This part of our inherited culture is true across Canada, not just Northern Ontario. Indeed, when you consider the cost of the requisite tags from the government and the cost of your rifle, ammo, etc., this pales in comparison to the cost of going to the local grocer and buying meat for a year. Factor in the carbon tax, which makes food much more expensive, along with other levels of taxation that have been levied against the people by successive governments, and they are naturally going to look for ways to cut expenses. Hunting is one of those ways, and to do this, firearms are generally required. That's the practical position on hunting, and I would like to offer something a bit more philosophical. Hunting is a legal activity in most of the world, and is part of the heritage that all Canadians share. The Ministry of Natural Resources takes great pain in ensuring that hunting is done in the most environmentally responsible way possible to preserve the ability to hunt while maintaining healthy animal populations. Your personal sensibilities are irrelevant, and you are not the arbiter of morality, nor should you be trying to force your sense of morality on anyone else. You're certainly free to dislike hunting, as I do, but you have no right to attempt to stop others from exercising their rights and ability to partake in a legal activity. So let's focus on the first point, and as you recall, it contains several smaller discrete arguments to bolster the overall position, which is that firearms are not needed and should be banned to prevent further violence. This is the mainstay of the political left and is parroted on cue by all manner of advocacy groups, and is rooted in the premise that banning firearms or creating gun-free zones will eliminate gun violence. On the surface, this position seems to have a certain amount of logic to it, and to the people who know very little about the topic, which is most of the population, they view this as a sensible approach. Quite simply, if there are no guns, there is no gun violence. Now, for this assertion to be true, then the root cause of gun violence in larger urban centers would have to be perpetuated by legal firearm owners who are running amok for some reason or another. However, that's not what's happening. The gun violence that is currently plaguing large urban centers in both Canada and the United States is the result of illegal guns being used by criminals and gangs, full stop. So, if the truth is that the gun violence is the result of illegal guns being used by criminal gangs, then how can a gun ban or the creation of a gun-free zone result in the desired outcome of no gun violence? The answer is that it can't. In the end, government can institute whatever ban they want, coupled with a never-ending stream of legislation, but it's pointless. Criminals don't obey the law. Law-abiding citizens do, and they are not the problem. On August 9th, 2019, the Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders held a press conference. Let's hear what he has to say.
So on Monday, August the 5th, in the early hours, police were called to sounds of gunshot in 18 Yorkville Avenue area. Upon further investigation, men and women were able to make one arrest for a person that was arrested for failing to comply. Further investigation has determined that we believe that person belongs to a street gang. 27, the Bridle Path. Again, on Sunday, August the 4th, in the early hours, what had occurred was a robbery with 3 suspects involved. Through the hard work of 33 Division and 33 Major Crime and others, a male has been arrested for that offense. The victims for that are not from Toronto, in fact, not from the province. We've made an arrest, and during that arrest, we were able to retrieve a firearm. There are 2 more people that I believe are outstanding for that, and that investigation is still ongoing. On August the 5th, at approximately 4:16, Toronto police were called to the area of Church and Adelaide with regards to the sound of shots, gunshots. Upon their arrival, there were 2 victims. I can tell you at that scene, there was a firearm, and we have evidence that the victims that were shot, there was an exchange of gunfire. Through a lot of hard work by officers from 51 Division, 51 CIB, Major Crime, we were able to arrest 3 people, and they're in the process of looking for one person outstanding. There will be a warrant that would be put out for that person shortly, and hopefully with the assistance of the media and the community, we'll be able to locate that person. We have also received and seized another firearm as a result, and the information with regards to that is that members are involved in street gangs. So we've recovered guns and made arrests, and we're optimistic about some of the other ongoing investigations. We'll definitely be making more arrests with respect to these recent shootings and others in the past. Our Gun and Gang Task Force and intelligence services continue to place a high priority on all of these investigations, and we're also actively working to be present in the areas that are currently high risk. I do want to underline that this recent gun activity, these shootings that have happened over the past 10 days, by and large, have street gang connotations to them or are street gang related, and the vast majority of them, we cannot exclude street gang subculture activity to it. It does not mean at times that innocent people are not impacted. A lot of people do have concerns. The city definitely has concerns. In these rare instances in Toronto over the past couple of years, when that has happened, it's truly traumatic to those individuals and to their families. It's clear to say that there are more firearms that are out there. And you're right, they are utilized for disputes. But most of the street gang members that have guns, for the most part, it is to protect themselves. However, if an opportunity arises, then they will use. That's number one. But then when it comes to the retaliation point, where gang member A goes over to gang B and firearms up, then now Team B wants to retaliate. So now they have the guns, but it's not to protect themselves now, it's to answer to the initial retaliation piece. So it's frustrating because it all cores into the street gang subculture, and that becomes a problem. And so when people are saying, you know, street gangs, so put people in jail, there is a far bigger picture to this. It's not just a matter of incarceration. We have to get it right. And those are the directions and those are the things we're moving towards. And as I stated earlier, all levels of government have been understanding. They all do not like what they see, and they all want to take an active part in figuring out what the proper solutions are overall. So right now, there are approximately 326 people that are charged with firearms offenses that are out on bail right now. So what we are hoping to do is establish a stronger relationship with our courts to let them know that the impact that these types of offenses are having within our communities. And you can see the growing concerns that are happening. And so we need that deterrent factor because a lot of people are in possession of firearms right now. The street gangs right now, I can tell you, just in recent, are definitely shooting. There are more shooting occurrences that are happening, but we can't do it alone. It has to be a collective approach from many angles, and the courts is definitely one of them that we would like to have the conversation with. But it's 326 right now that are on bail, that are on firearms-related offenses.
The main takeaway from this interview is that most of the gun violence is gang-related, which of course is criminal. The other point that needs mentioning is how many people are out on bail for firearm-related offenses, 326 of them, which also points to deficiencies in our legal system. Mark Saunders isn't the only police chief who was frustrated at the inaction of government. Several other police chiefs are echoing his frustrations, with some blatantly stating the proposed plan of action will be ineffective and a waste of resources. Indeed, the head of the RCMP recently came out making the same claims. However, undeterred by the facts, Minister Blair continues down a path that I believe has been constructed with the sole intention of making the costs and associated liability of complying with the proposed new laws so onerous that people are going to throw in the towel and walk away. If enough people do this, then the Liberals will then claim that Canadians have rejected firearm ownership and will then introduce final legislation to officially ban them, while also instituting a buyback program under the auspices of the public good to clean up anything that remains. Regular listeners have often heard me talk about liberal arrogance and the blatant lies that socialist liberalism has brought us since 2015. This is most evidenced with the following two clips. The first is by Adam Vaughan, who is a Liberal MP and quite possibly the most extreme leftist politician ever to be elected, and the second is the campaign ad that Bill Blair ran in the recent 2019 federal election. Let's listen to Adam Vaughan first.
We need to know that when someone buys 10 handguns, why they're doing it. And I think if the data shows that there are certain patterns that need to be regulated, that's how you do gun control. You drive it from evidence, you drive it from investigation, you drive it from source, and you modify the practice. There is no rational reason to own a gun in the city of Toronto. No rational reason whatsoever. Either you're afraid of something or somebody, or you're afraid that your personal security can't be protected by law enforcement. If that's the situation, we need to address it. But the other side of it is hobbyists and target shooters. Those are hobbies. Those aren't needs. And so at a certain point, we have to be smart about handguns as they present themselves in the city of Toronto. We have to track it back to source and figure out how we make sure they don't end up in the hands of the wrong people. Because as far as I'm concerned, too many bullets are flying around downtown Toronto, and in crowded cities, when bullets fly, people die. It's not good enough to pretend it's all coming across the border anymore when the facts are presented differently.
So people in Toronto should not have handguns at all?
From my perspective, my personal perspective, I don't own a gun, and I can't see why anyone else would. And if it's a need to do target practice or collect, at a certain point, if a practice becomes dangerous to the public, we have to re-examine the practice. It is different in rural Canada. I have a sister who ran I understand the argument of hunters and fishers, but no one's using handguns to cull the raccoon population in Toronto. Handguns are being used to kill people in Toronto, and quite frankly, we've had enough.
Vaughan's diatribe is probably the most honest to come from the political left on this topic outside of Beto O'Rourke in the US. It's also a great example of the first point and main argument that the political left always uses, which is to question the need for firearms when law enforcement is in place. He then proceeds to wrap his position in emotion and progressive morality while scolding people for owning a firearm. Furthermore, according to Vaughan, the needs of the state are more important than the rights of the individual, which is not only a slippery slope for any politician to venture onto, it also clearly illustrates the lack of understanding surrounding the foundations of the Western world in firearm ownership. He finishes off by callously demeaning a legal pursuit to a simplistic perspective of being a hobby which has no value. For an extremist like Adam Vaughan to have found a welcoming home in the modern Liberal Party is deeply regrettable. As for Minister Blair, there are a lot of videos out there that clearly illustrates him evading specific questions about the Liberal plan and how it will solve the problem. I will leave those for you to seek out. However, nothing clearly demonstrates the rhetoric and misinformation from Minister Blair more than the following campaign ad that he authorized and endorsed from the recent 2019 general election. Have a listen.
Before I was a Liberal MP, I was the Chief of Police in Toronto. I spent decades working to keep my city safe, and I know that the presence of a gun in a dangerous situation can make it deadly. We're going to do something about it with stronger gun control laws and a ban on assault rifles. The Conservatives talk tough, but they won't do what needs to be done. Soon you'll have a choice. Let the Conservatives weaken our gun control laws, or make your community safer by making gun laws stronger. I'm Bill Blair. Choose forward.
Authorized by the registered agent for the Liberal Party of Canada.
There are two main points that I want to highlight. First, true assault weapons have been banned in Canada since the 80s, and even then they weren't a thing here. Furthermore, like every other political ad used by the Liberals in the recent election, this one uses their weapon of choice, which is fear, in an attempt to persuade the public to adopt the same position that the Liberals hold dear. As mentioned earlier, there is the emergence of a fourth argument that, although still taking shape and being refined, is being tested by the political left along with the media to see how effective it currently is and what needs to change for it to become even more effective. This argument centers around one of the new tenets of social progressivism, which is to frame every issue to represent the existence of toxic masculinity, which invariably becomes an attempt to illustrate the patriarchy. When the patriarchy is mentioned as part of any social issue, the clear meaning is the topic of debate is the latest in an ongoing series of immediate threats to women, biological or pretend, at the hands of men to oppress them and ensure their slavery and servitude. More on this in a later episode. The gun debate in Canada has been raging almost as long as the abortion debate, possibly longer. The political left routinely uses misinformation and emotional thuggery to support a narrative that cannot otherwise be supported by facts. Not only have the various Liberal governments over the past 50 years pushed this narrative, but the media have also contributed to the lies told to the people. How can I say this with such conviction? It's easy when you know that the data simply doesn't exist to support the narrative. Although the RCMP doesn't have much data, or at least doesn't make much of it public, the same is not true of the United States. The FBI and Department of Homeland Security have made quite a bit of data available, and we can easily draw the necessary facts from it. Put simply, the highest level of gun violence occurs in large urban centers, which is no surprise considering that urban centers are much more densely populated than rural areas. What people may find surprising is that the urban centers that have the highest instances of gun violence already have very strict laws pertaining to firearms and are already classified as gun-free zones. This is not to say that other areas don't have gun violence, quite the contrary. There is gun violence across the United States. However, the distinguishing point here is the level of violence and where it is. For instance, in Texas and Utah, where support for the Second Amendment is almost universal and the citizens can carry a firearm on their person, the rates of violence in these states is drastically lower than other areas such as Chicago, Detroit, Minnesota, and Los Angeles, just to name a few where there are very strict laws relating to firearms. Different conclusions can be drawn from this data, with one such conclusion being that the states governed by Democrats have much higher instances of gun violence than those states governed by Republicans. The one conclusion that cannot be disputed is that banning firearms and declaring a city or state as a gun-free zone is meaningless. The data also clearly indicates that the gun violence is almost exclusively gangs and other criminal interests. So how does this data apply to Canada? Well, quite simple. Minister Blair is advocating for the same approach, which has proven to be a complete failure in the United States, Australia, and other areas of the Western world where the highest demographic of gun violence is committed by gangs and criminals. Like many have mentioned before, criminals don't follow the law, so how can this plan of action have a positive impact? Well, the answer is that it can't. It's a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, which naturally leads to a different question. What problem is this a solution for? That answer brings us back to the overall goal of the political left, which is to disarm the people. Now, before you start dismissing this as a conspiracy theory, let's review the facts. Number 1. There is consensus within the leadership of law enforcement, including the RCMP, that the Liberal Action Plan will not be effective, with some saying it is a waste of resources. This sentiment is consistent with every poll that I have seen on the topic, ironically, even in Toronto. Number 2. Why would Minister Blair, who was the former police chief in Ontario, reject the input of his peers and his own experience and continue down this path that not only doesn't have the support of a majority of Canadians, but also does not have the support of the data? Number 3. How can we account for all of the deliberate misinformation being passed off as facts and force-fed to the people, which has a clear intent of biasing them? Number 4. If Minister Blair and the Liberals really wanted to look at effective policy relating to firearms, why wouldn't they start by classifying weapons based on a host of quantifiable metrics that have been proposed over the years? Instead, they are making a choice to continue to classify based on emotions and aesthetics. Number 5. Why would Minister Goodale set up a working group to advise government and then stack that working group with people who were victims of gun violence who are also strong advocates for a total ban on all firearms? Obviously, these folks couldn't be relied upon to be impartial. Number 6. During the past election cycle, the folks at the CCFR, who are a firearms advocacy group, did a road trip called the Integrity Tour to challenge the assertion of the Liberals. Although they had a tough time finding integrity, they eventually had a turn of good fortune along the way and managed to speak with Minister Blair directly. When he was challenged with several facts put forth by Rob Giltaca and Tracy Wilson, all Minister Blair could do was pivot to the default emotional position of progressive morality to justify his approach, while denying the evidence presented that illustrated that his approach would not accomplish the stated goals. Number 7. Possibly the most interesting event that I have observed is why are there new advocacy groups popping up calling for gun bans whenever a tragedy occurs involving firearms? These groups are well funded and organized, and this can only happen with outside help. True grassroots movements take a long time to get going in a meaningful way. In a conversation I had with a friend who was a devout liberal where we talked about these points, the only answer he thought was representative was government incompetence and waste. Now, while most Canadians can certainly get behind the premise that governments are generally incompetent and wasteful, this can't be the whole story. If it was, then Canadians would be guilty of electing the most incompetent government in the history of Canada, whose incompetence would have to be exponentially greater than ever before. I realize that there are some of you right now nodding your heads in agreement to this statement, but let's be realistic. Incompetence can't be the sole reason, and I think that's the lazy way out while also denying the facts. Further, it's also continuing a terrible Canadian tradition of rationalizing the ongoing problems in Canada, including government largesse, as incompetence. I think Beto O'Rourke had it right when he let it slip on the presidential campaign trail in 2019 when he said, loud and proud, that he was coming for everyone's AR-15 and would ignore the Second Amendment to the applause of those in attendance. Although he may have been literal with the specific firearm he mentioned, his intent was much broader and was meant to encompass all firearms. He is not alone here, and variations of this statement have been echoed by several Democrats and appears to be a belief that is largely held across the Democratic Party. Furthermore, the same belief is widely held within the Trudeau Liberals, as both parties share a common ideology which has become more and more radical over the past decade. Even a minority government hasn't dissuaded the Liberals from continuing with their plans for a gun ban. They have only become a bit more creative in its implementation. The latest approach of choice is devolving the power to ban legal firearm ownership to the cities. Not only is this foolish, but it is also cowardly. Should this plan succeed, and Toronto decides to ban firearms, then the federal Liberals could wash their hands of any accountability and deflect all opposition to the local governments while claiming success. Furthermore, this approach is almost certainly illegal, as the criminal code falls under the exclusive legislative jurisdiction of the federal government. The power to enact criminal law is derived from Section 91, subsection 27 of the Constitution Act of 1867. I'm not sure how any action by a city or municipality could possibly be upheld by the courts. Then again, since the judiciary seems more interested in political activism these days, I guess we'll find out in time should the Liberals continue with this plan. It will also be interesting whether the provincial government in Ontario would make this the second time they bring the federal government to court, as Premier Doug Ford has been very vocal as being against any form of gun ban. In the end, there is a profound reason why the founding fathers of the United States went down a different path and made the possession of firearms a constitutionally protected right, as they had the foresight to recognize what government could become given the right circumstances. Had other countries done something similar, then the despots of the 20th century like Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, Lenin, Mao Zedong, Castro, Marcos, Mugabe, Idi Amin, Pinochet, Pol Pot, generations of the Kim family in North Korea, Saddam Hussein, and of course the Ayatollahs in Iran, wouldn't have been able to bring the crushing power of government, including the military, down on its citizens. Like many Canadians, I suspect the people of those countries couldn't bring themselves to believe that despotism could ever happen to them. As history has shown, by the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. In the 21st century, we see history repeating itself in Latin America. When the people can't fight back, it's easy to exert unfettered control, as we recently witnessed in Venezuela, with the military running down its citizens with armored vehicles. Despotic control always begins with the process of disarming the people, and that's where the Western world seems to be heading, and the political left seems desperate to get there as soon as possible. In Canada, the face of this progression is a socialist with nice hair, likes yoga, selfies, and hates the West, especially Alberta. Most Canadians not only have a lack of understanding about firearms, they also have a lack of understanding about the realities of history and the lessons it has continually tried to teach us. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I would like to thank you for listening. Please give us a like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you're listening to this on YouTube, please also click the notification bell so that you'll be notified when there is a new episode. If you have suggestions, comments, or would like to express constructive feedback, please drop us an email at mailbag@thepeoplesconversation.ca. We always enjoy hearing from our listeners, even those that disagree with us. Also, please visit our Patreon page and donate to the show. Your donation will help us to do more and will expand the content that we are able to provide. Finally, always remember that a country without basic freedoms, especially freedom of speech, is a country without a future. Until next time, stay safe and be well.